My name's Wendy Galerter. I will be hosting this meeting today. We also have Help Desk Larry in the room, and he can help with any technical difficulties you have. And I want to get started right away because we have a great agenda today. Again, this is Take Action San Diego. This is our monthly Zoom meeting. We are a chapter of Indivisible and also Swing Left. And one of our main activities is to bring people together on a monthly basis, give them some good information that they may not have had before, and then to provide them with actions they can take today and for the next several weeks. So we have Jim Miller here to talk to us about the history of May Day, and then also Bridget Browning here to talk to us about May Day today, its significance, and maybe even its significance for the future. And we will wrap up at the end of the meeting with a quick recap of No Kings, and also, as always, talking about some actions you can take in the coming weeks. But let me start with introducing Jim Miller, Dr. Jim Miller, and a lot of you may know of him already. You may have taken classes from him at San Diego City College in English, in humanities, or in labor studies. You may know him because you've read his poetry or his novels or his nonfiction books. Or maybe you subscribe to his Substack, which I highly recommend, or you read him in the blog Words and Deeds. So you can see he's sort of a busy guy. If you haven't heard of him in all of these many ways, you're in for a big treat today. And so, welcome, Jim. I will let you take it away. Do you have any slides, or are you going to just talk?
No, I'm just talking.
Okay, I'm going to stop
Hopefully
sharing.
not too much.
That
Basically, just going to give a little sort of mini lecture on the history of May Day, and then we'll see if there's some time for questions, and we'll go from there. So we're here today in the shadow of a gathering fascism. When we say that it's not about the historical analogy to Germany or Italy in the 1930s, it's about clearly recognizing what's happening right now. The assault on civil liberties for marginalized groups, especially immigrants, the destruction of collective bargaining rights for federal workers, defunding and dismantling the helping agencies of the government, while massively increasing the budget for repressive apparatus, putting the United States military, while massively increasing the budget for repressive apparatus, putting the United States military into the streets of American cities against the will of the people, attacks on free speech in universities, and on the justice system, on the media, and the ongoing threat and reality of war. And all of this will only get worse unless it gets stopped. And May Day has a lot to say about this. So on May Day, we remember the story of American workers who struggled and died for the rights that many of us take for granted, whether it be the 8-hour day, workplace safety regulations, prohibitions against child labor, the existence of the weekend, or many of the other basic economic rights like the minimum wage that came only as the result of the heroic activism by ordinary American workers. So I always like to say in my class, here we are on a Saturday, many people don't have to work. Somebody died for your weekend. And now in the second Trump era, we resist all attempts, to bring us back to a time when American workers, and that means most of us, had no basic economic rights, no significant power, or any real voice in our democracy. Attacks on labor and the economic well-being of ordinary Americans have been going on for decades, but at present, they're being pushed into overdrive. And we're going back to the future more quickly and more thoroughly than many people realize. As the research by Thomas Piketty shows, income for the bottom 50% of Americans is collapsing, while the income of the top 1% is soaring. The result of this is a dramatic new level of inequality not seen since the 19th century. And you throw in the AI boom, which is only fueling fire, to this, and we are still yet to recognize the true scope of the inequality that we're facing now. This is a very real threat to our democracy. But why talk about this on May Day? Or on the week of May Day. Why does May 1st have anything to do with this? Well, May Day has deep American roots. It's not something that came from the Soviet Union. It's something that began in the heart of American history. So it started in 1866 as part of a movement pushing for the 8-hour day. As historian Jacob Reams reminds us, the demand for the 8-hour day was about leisure, self-improvement, and freedom, but it was also about power. When 8-hour leagues first agitated for legislation requiring shorter hours, they were demanding what had never before happened, that the government regulate industry for the advantage of workers. And when workers sought to enforce the 8-hour day without the government, through declaring for themselves through their unions under what circumstances they would work, they sought something still more radical: control over their own workplaces. It is telling that employers would often counter a demand for shorter hours with an offer of a wage increase. Wage increases could be given and then later taken away by employers without giving up their power. Agreeing to shorter hours was, employers at the time knew, giving up their power, the beginning of losing their arbitrary power over their workers. So in the course of this effort, the nationwide American labor movement was born. Workers joined together in the service of the principle that in the emerging industrial age, they should have a say in their economic lives and a voice in our politics, neither of which would come without a fight. This campaign led to the passage of the first 8-hour day law in Illinois that was set to take place on May 1st, 1867. Chicago workers celebrated its enactment with a huge parade and other festivities. Unfortunately, the next day, employers refused to recognize or implement the law, making their workers stay for the customary 10 or 11 hours. The workers responded with a massive general strike that was eventually crushed by the state militia. By the 1880s, a revitalized labor movement took up the issue of the 8-hour day once again. In 1886, workers in Chicago, led by anarchists, called for a general strike on May 1st, and they vowed not to return to their jobs until employers agreed to an 8-hour day. But it was more than a general strike. It was a struggle against the rule of the very rich and corporate monopolies, and a call for what they called a cooperative commonwealth, where democracy was controlled not by moneyed interests, not by the robber barons of that earlier Gilded Age. These workers wanted to own their own time, their own lives, and have a say in the society in which they lived. This was, of course, met with fierce resistance yet again from police and the powers that be, and this led to the famous events at Haymarket Square in Chicago. There, an unidentified man threw a bomb into a crowd of protesting workers, killing a policeman, which led the police to fire on a crowd. This resulted in the arrest and conviction of 8 anarchists, 4 of whom were eventually hung with absolutely no hard evidence of their guilt. Eventually, American workers would win their struggle for the 8-hour day, but May Day itself has been largely forgotten in the United States, despite its continued recognition internationally until quite recently. In recent years, the immigrants' rights movement, Occupy, and other activist groups have revived May Day, to inspire new struggles for workers' rights. So here, for example, in the very first big immigrants' rights march, over a decade ago, we had 50,000 people starting off in Balboa Park, one of the largest immigrant rights marches, right, on May Day, during the beginning of that movement. This is well before the Trump era. But what's important for us to keep in mind during our present Gilded Age is how hard the struggle was to get many of the things that people take for granted in the American workplace and in American democracy. There are forces afoot in America that are in the process of returning us to the era of the old robber barons, when the notion of a world with workplace democracy and basic workers' rights was merely a dream. They'd like to permanently bury the idea that working people standing together can play a key role in our society and have real political power. Across the country, not just collective bargaining, but many other hard-won gains from worker safety laws to Social Security are in jeopardy, with billionaire-funded groups pushing rollbacks of once taken for granted rights in state houses in the nation's capital. Project 2025, Elon Musk, the whole ball of wax. So with the Trump administration in power for a second time, along with the wrecking crew in Congress, the dreams of those who would like to turn the United States into the best democracy that money can buy are coming to fruition. On the extensive wish list of the plutocrats in charge is the privatization of education, the destruction of healthcare, the deconstruction of the state, the elimination of buffers against the hard edges of the marketplace that the New Deal established, worker protections, collective bargaining in particular. They also want free rein to destroy the commons, pollute the planet, threaten the future health of our children. Consequences be damned. These new lords of the American marketplace are using their wealth to undermine the Commonwealth as they seek to silence the voices of those whose actual speech they hope can't match their spending. So on May Day, we need to remember the words of the old labor slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all." This is the fundamental principle that when one person is denied basic rights, opportunity, or human dignity, we all suffer. Whether they may be workers, immigrants, students, women, people of color, Muslims, the LGBTQ community, or others at risk in this dangerous time for our democracy. We must insist on a future based not on a politics of hate, division, inequality, and exploitation, but on the idea that democracy at its best is a beloved community where together we can rise up and prosper. And I think, Wendy wanted me to talk a little bit about, and I'll be very brief to kind of end this, about like what are the local ties in? And I think, in more contemporary times, that huge immigrants' rights march and the continued thriving of the immigrants' rights movement and the kind of ICE out protests are very much in the legacy, of this, of immigrants' rights activists, appropriation and use of May Day. Really not really appropriation, but kind of just that they're kind of occupying, the spirit of May Day and reviving it in so many ways. But looking backward, another key moment in San Diego labor history that was central is the San Diego free speech fight, where down at 5th and E, and in the gas lamp, you had the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, standing on soapboxes initially for the idea just to organize, but this became a central civil rights and free speech and public assembly issue when, of course, police and then vigilantes tried to repress this, and the city of San Diego actually passed an ordinance banning free speech in a 55-block area in downtown San Diego. And 5,000 IWW members and other labor activists flooded into San Diego to struggle for the right to stand on the street and say what you want. And not just IWW members, but other people, religious activists, other parts of labor that weren't sympathetic to the Wobblies, people who believed in civil liberties sort of joined with them in this struggle. And in fact, that free speech fight struggle is the birth of the ACLU, right? That's when it was the news articles about that struggle here in San San Diego that are the first things that you can find in the archive of the ACLU when you look at that. So really San Diego kind of just, really just a number of decades after, Haymarket became one of the other central places where, people were murdered, tortured, beaten, and, pretty thoroughly repressed simply for trying to exercise their rights for free speech, public assembly, here in San Diego. And people talk about that, as a free speech fight, and it very much was. But fundamentally, it was a struggle brought to you by the labor movement, right? And that's, I think, something that was also in the legacy of, May Day and, the Haymarket martyrs, right? And really how May Day became international. One last little caveat, and I'll stop and open it up if there are questions, is that the people who were hung after the Haymarket incident became sort of martyrs. And there were, a march with tens of thousands of people in Chicago, all over the United States. And it became a kind of international movement, right? To remember the Haymarket martyrs, right? And this is something that was kind of became an international worker solidarity day. And it was really the result of the first and second Red Scares. People forget the first one, but the first Red Scare in the teens around World War I was probably, just as severe, if not more, than the McCarthy period, right? And that sort of, wiped May Day off of the slate of even the labor movement until, as I mentioned, quite recent years when this indigenous American history has been, reborn, in many labor councils and unions, across the United States. So with that, I'll stop, see if anybody has questions, see if Bridget wants to add anything, go from there.
Great. Oh, thank you, Jim, so much. That was really the history I was hoping for, and kind of gave the lie to the fact that San Diego is just this beach town, military town, where people didn't really care about politics. I think there's been that going on, maybe sometimes more quietly than others, but all along, and I think revived today. Kelly, you had your hand up.
I did. I just wanted to note that I put a bunch of resources in the chat, including a link to a documentary that we had a hand in making on the San Diego free speech fight, and then also a link to the Labor and Climate Justice Education Committee of the California Federation of Teachers, the webpage for May Day. There's a wonderful documentary on that too, made by one of the only California labor historians, Fred Glass, who's a good friend of ours. So you might check it out. And then, of course, I put a plug in for an event that's coming up about Under the Perfect Sun. So just resources.
Thank you very much. And as usual, we follow up these Zooms with an email that will list all of the links that are discussed today. So you don't have to try to scramble to write them down. We get that email out about 24 hours, within 24 hours of this meeting. Do anybody have some questions for Jim about May Day? I guess I have one, and maybe that'll provoke another one or two. But do you think that May Day can become the kind of the rallying point going forward for not just San Diego, I guess, but for the country as well, to kind of recognize that, workers, immigrants, leftists, disillusioned MAGAists, everybody can kind of unite around this idea of rights for everybody. Do we have the potential to bring that back that way?
Yeah, the way I look at that is there is a call in various circles in labor to call a general strike, in 2028, right? Sort of building toward this. And the way that I look at this is whether or not we build that capacity. What something like the events in Minneapolis showed us is that sometimes events spontaneously can help people collectively remember those parts of our history, right? And that Minneapolis, I would say it was a general strike of sorts, not to be too academic about it, right? But the number of those kinds of general strike events in American history, are not common, right? So what we've seen just quite recently in Minneapolis is a remarkable occasion, right? The way they were able to shut the city down and essentially, win a battle in a skirmish against, the United States government. And I think that, events like this coming May Day, and all of these other kind of actions inside and outside of labor are kind of kind of the way I look at them is sort of training days for perhaps a larger, movement, right? A larger movement and a larger ability to do this. So, for example, like one of the big advocates for this is Alex Caputo Pearl, who's former president, but current activist in United Teachers Los Angeles, right? And you see that some of the kind of recently the teacher strikes in red states, and some of UTLA's big actions in Los Angeles have been very reminiscent of this kind of activism. Chicago Teachers Union, other places as well as militant actions by everybody from janitors to hotel workers to other folks too. So I think the potential is there, but it's a matter of kind of relearning how to use those tools, relearning how to use the tool of a strike. And Bridget can speak a little bit more about kind of how hard it is to use that tool and why it's important for labor to not forget how to use that muscle, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with, kind of how external events impact, the coming months. Right. So not to give a vague answer, but I think, whenever you're trying to predict things that close to your face, it's tough to make that answer. So the hopeful side of me says yes, that Minneapolis is an example of one such event in a major American city. And yes, it can happen. Right. But I also think it's also likely that we can see a series of sort of smaller events that lead up to a larger event, depending on what it is that we find ourselves up against.
Great. Well, I think that was a great segue to Bridget, who I just want to give a brief introduction for. Most of you know her. She is the president of the San Diego and Imperial Counties Labor Council, the Union of Unions, I guess it's called, over 136 unions and over 200,000 union members and their families that are represented. And she's also the president of Unite Here, which Local 30, which represents hotel workers and gaming and food service workers. She is a powerhouse organizer and a progressive leader with a deceptively soft voice. And she has collaborated with groups like ours in the highly successful No Kings rallies and many other events around San Diego. And she's here today to follow up on Jim's history with kind of May Day present and future. So thanks for being here, Bridget.
Oh, well, thanks for such a lovely intro. And it's great to see some old friends and hopefully new people that haven't met me before. I think a lot of labor's decline and unions' decline was because we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing. Everybody says, oh, it was because of Reagan and Patco, but I think a lot of it had to do with the unions really moved away from militant action and almost became like partners with the corporations, in particular in the private sector, because that's where we basically don't exist anymore. Like without the public sector jobs, like the labor movement would be very small, unfortunately. And I don't think that we can really combat capitalism if we're not organizing in the private sector. So I started out as a non-union organizer. I'm very passionate about it. And I view May Day as kind of coming back to our roots, because when I first started in the labor movement, there were no May Day actions. And on Labor Day in September, there were picnics. which I found very offensive because I don't think on our day we should be in a jumpy in a park. Like I think we should be in the streets demanding change. In particular for our members that are like barely struggling. My union has a slogan that one job should be enough because so many of our members have to work two full-time jobs. And that impacts all of us because if a worker has two full-time jobs, they're not at home in the evening to do homework with their kids. And then when their kids are struggling in school, we blame the teachers as if it's the teacher's fault that the child doesn't have help at home. Or perhaps the child doesn't even know if they're going to have dinner at home, which creates so much stress that it really, I think, has created a very unstable system for our families in the future. And I'm very concerned about it, but I'm also very hopeful about it. I feel like, but it's only going to come from us. Like national leaders are not going to fix this for us. When the Democrats lost so badly, and then their solution was to go have a retreat at one of the most exclusive golf resorts in the country that costs upwards of $1,000 a room night. They're like so tone deaf that I honestly don't think they understand what it's like to worry about like how am I going to fill my prescription or how am I going to buy dinner for my kids or pay my huge SDG&E bill. And I really think we need to figure out our Project 25. Obviously, we're not going to call it that. But we need to have it ready and we need to elect somebody who's going to have the courage to implement it. Because the one thing Trump has done is he's had courage to force his agenda through. He's shown us how it can be done, but we need to have somebody like that too. We can't waste like what we did in 2008 and only get the Affordable Care Act and no other changes that really uplifted Americans who are struggling and are angry because they don't feel like the American dream is viable for them or their kids. And so I'm really hoping that we have a complete restructuring in the next few years so that, my son he's 24 years old. He's talking about moving back home because he's struggling so much because the rent is so expensive. And that's not good for his mental health. Like, I'm happy to have him live with us, but I feel like all of his friends are experiencing this same thing that they can't even strike out on their own and like build their own families because it's just so expensive here. And so I'm hoping the May Day event we're creating building blocks to move to a much more militant, engaged, both with community and religious folks and with labor, so that we can have wholesale reforms in 2028, which take money out of the billionaires' hands and put it back into our communities where it belongs. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be marching from the Waterfront Park. I know you all are very familiar with it. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of places where there's good public transportation. We had wanted to start over by the convention center to kind of change it up a little bit, but there's a Padres game, and so we were concerned that it would make it very difficult for people to park over there. So that's why we're going to start at Waterfront Park. We're going to march to the Federal Building, and then we're going to end at Civic Center at the City of San Diego, the headquarters of the cities of San Diego. I know a lot of you came to our May Day event last year, which was awesome. It's a very different crowd than No Kings. There's a lot of immigrant workers come to it, so I think it's a really fun event. The energy's great, the chanting's awesome. The Resistors are our go-to band. They're going to be playing to have us feeling good, and I feel like this is going to be kind of the platform for us taking back the 48th congressional district from the Republicans and from Darrell Issa, who was an abhorrent human being. And so I just feel like it's going to be the springboard for big changes, both in 2026, but also in 2028. But I would just challenge us as a group, like, who's putting together our version of Project 2025. Like, it needs to have comprehensive immigration reform. It needs to have protections for LGBT communities. It needs to have a tax on billionaires so that they just can't move states to avoid paying their fair share. It needs to abolish ICE. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But frankly, if we're not orchestrating that, it's not going to happen. And so I really want to challenge us to kind of try to set the table for that to happen. And I don't know if there's any questions for me.
Thank you, Bridget. I have a question. Will you write Project 2025 for us, please?
I mean, I could do what the labor reforms should be. I'm happy to do that. I am not an expert in all the other areas. And what I fear is going to happen, because this is what happened in '08, is suddenly there was power and everybody started fighting with each other. Literally, everybody was fighting each other because my idea is better than your idea. So you're a bad person, Wendy, because you don't agree with me. And we wasted so much time that we need to be doing it now and have now I know there's some people on the fringe who will never agree with us. I'm not talking about them, but I'm talking us about a real coalition agreeing about this is what we need to drive in DC, because we're going to get power back. I believe that. Now, whether we're going to have courageous people who are willing to completely change the systems, that's up to us, right? I wish more people were running against the incumbents, to be honest, because I feel like there's a lot of entrenched people that they say the right things, but they don't necessarily want change because it's working for them. Like in perimenopause, the guy that's running for Senate in Maine, I think he's great. Like,
Graham Plattner.
yes, thank you. Thank you, Wendy. I think we should be running people like that all over the country. And I think that they would have the courage to enact real change. So I can work on the labor stuff, but I'm not an expert on immigration reform. Although I would say for immigration reform, there has to be an exemption for people that didn't show up to their court appointments, because I wouldn't go to my court appointment right now with ICE waiting to deport me. And so I really think we have to figure that out. We have to figure out the TPS. Like, we have a lot of Haitian workers that they have a work authorization and then the next day they don't, and then they have it back again, and they get fired and rehired and fired. And it's just so traumatic for them and their families, this instability. And if anybody thinks Haiti is a safe place to go live in, like they clearly don't know anything about what's happening in Haiti. And so they don't get talked about a lot in the immigration conversation, but they come to our office a lot, so they're very visible for me, and I'm very passionate about trying to get them permanent status here. So
Yeah.
sorry, I kind of just went on and on. I apologize.
No, I mean, clearly it's going to take a concerted effort among many of us. But I totally agree. And Joanna had her hand up. And unmute, please, Joanna.
Yeah, I come from a background that is professional and middle class. And I have two grandchildren. One's in high school and one's in middle school. And they and their parents have been very eager to participate in the kinds of protest movement that have been organized so far in San Diego. And I'm wondering if you have any resources to point to or ideas as to how those kinds of kids can become broader in their understanding of the labor movement and the needs that are effective for that group, and how they can become partners in a May Day experience and make it something that's constructive all around.
If you don't mind it, I'd like to give that to Jim and Kelly, just because they do a lot of work with young people, and I feel like they're more the experts on that than I am.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the one practical thing I can think of is, like, for example, right now we have another week where we're accepting applications for the AFT internship. right? Where you learn about labor, you learn about social justice work, you get, there's a couple interns on the Zoom here today. In addition to that, AFT has for many, many years also helped fund the Students for Economic Justice internship that CPI runs, which also works with labor, works with activist groups, gets young people into the community. And then a third option is the UCSD Labor Center internship, right? So if the kids are at UCSD, they get a chance to, do this. And the good thing about all three of these programs is they're paid, right? So you don't have to, just have enough money to go work for free for several months or for a semester. It actually can help you, pay a couple bills while you're doing this. It's not a full-time job in our case, nor in SEJ's, but I think we've tried to make collectively as a community working with young people, make an effort to not have the internships for social justice itself be exploitative. Which, as many of you who have young people in your lives or are a young person, many, 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 many interns take young people and just turn them into free labor, right? For whatever organization they may be working with, right? So those are three really good options. And then I would also say just, many, many community groups working with things like this are starved for volunteers, whether that be, an organization like ACE or an environmental health coalition, right? And San Diego 350 and the climate, landscape, and I won't go on, but like, just, I think it wouldn't take more than just, a day doing a good search of kind of what are the local social justice works, right? If people want to maybe not do something as intensive as a full internship, but to volunteer, when they have the time to do that too. So those would be my ideas.
And if I could do just a brief plug, City College also has a labor studies program, which I coordinate. And so in the spring, in the evenings, Satomi Rash Ziegler, who's the director of the UCSD Labor Center, she and I team teach an organizing class. And so our interns who are here today are all in the class. And then in the fall, and so this fall, Jim's going to be teaching a labor history class on Mondays and Wednesdays at 11:10. And of course, at City College, we take the top 100% of applicants. So we are truly a community resource for everyone. We're only $46 a unit, and we're really nice. So, that's also a resource for people to take advantage of.
Very good. Thank you.
And Dina.
Hi, everyone. My question has to do with job losses. I'm wondering how the labor movement is addressing job losses due to offshoring and the new proliferation of AI in the workplace.
So we're trying very hard to, and we have tried to pass legislation in the last few years, governing about AI and protections for workers. Governor Newsom has vetoed them every time. He's very tight with the tech bros. He loves Silicon Valley. So I am very worried about what's going to happen to our workers because of AI. I think it's going to hurt certain industries more than others in the beginning, but I think as time goes by, it's going to be prolific. And in particular for younger people that are just looking for jobs now, I think it's going to make it very hard for them to find work. So I think we really need to have the AI legislation on a national level. But oftentimes California kind of leads the way. So if we could get something passed in California, it would probably help us get it passed nationally. But I'm unfortunately not very optimistic it's going to get signed by Newsom, since he's vetoed it so many times. And the offshoring, I don't think we're going to get those manufacturing jobs back. It feels to me like the ship has already sailed, and we need to figure out how to organize the non-union folks that are in other industries, because I think we could spend a lot of time. Like I can give you an example. I thought that there was going to be battery manufacturing in Imperial Valley. We represent Imperial Valley as well. It's, if you're not familiar with it, it's got the biggest deposit of lithium in North America. It's a very impoverished county. It's the poorest county in California. And during when the farms lay people off in the summer because it's too hot to work, unemployment soars to like 36% there. And so we were really excited with Biden and the Infrastructure Act, because there was a lot of money to build the batteries, the lithium batteries. And so we had this vision that there would be lithium extraction, but there would also be battery manufacturing, which would create good union jobs for people who are desperate for good jobs out there. And it's completely off the table now. Now they're gonna mine the lithium, and I believe they're gonna clean it and refine it somewhere else. And they're definitely not going to do the batteries in California anymore. And so if you have a president that takes subsidies away from manufacturing, it just feels to me unlikely that capitalists are going to spend extra money to do it here when they could just send the lithium somewhere else, not have environmental regulations, pay nothing for wages and worker safety, and maximize their profits. I mean, you could just send the lithium to Mexicali, which is like 15 miles away across the border in the Maquiladora zone. And my sense is that's probably what's going to happen, unfortunately.
So if I could follow up briefly, just two things. Number one, I would say when you vote for a governor, look at where the AI money is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Don't vote for a governor that's getting funded by AI money, because exactly what's happening with Newsom, exactly what's happening with key Democrats in Washington will happen if we elect a governor here who is elected with AI money. So, for example, Mahan is a pure product of the Silicon Valley tech bros, right? And he is somebody who they're going to spend a ton of money to, and may kind of help mess up the dynamics of that race. But the other thing, I think, more important point is, I think, going along with what Bridget's saying, I think that looking at kind of what the kind of disruption that this technology is going to bring, I think that like the technology is way over here in our our understanding of what the impact is. And people have trepidation, people have a little bit of fear. But I think that this is going to force us to both come to terms with a level of economic and power inequity that is really almost unimaginable to us, and I think that the thing that's going to be shocking to people is the way in which AI is going to disrupt and devastate white collar middle class work in a way that's, because we're used to like, oh, it's working class people who will lose jobs. AI has a deep potential to, wipe out huge swaths of jobs in higher education, right? AI has the potential to completely eliminate, whole swaths. Look, you have like right now, some of the tech companies are laying off 10% of their own workers. Right now, we're just in the beginning of this. So I think really what we're looking toward, looking backwards to this era we're talking about, and where we're headed, is we're going to need to as Americans, reimagine what the social contract really is. And unless we have an effort to fundamentally think about taxing the resources of the very rich in a way that redistributes wealth, and provides, for the people who are displaced and left behind, that we are going to be left with an incredible level of inequality that I think we are yet to really kind of grok. Not to be too dire on this point, but I just see what's happening before my very eyes in education. I have literally sometimes half of the people in my class, at a college level can't write, and some of the answers is like, oh, well, just let them use AI, right? Well, how disposable will those workers be? If that's what we are bringing people in terms of this. And I think that a lot of the attempts to kind of, well, we need to get ahead of this and work with it because you don't want to be left, behind if we don't help bring an AI in, are really kind of part of the sales pitch of it. I think really we need to kind of think about a collective strategy of mass resistance against this stuff, because they do not mean us well.
Well, and education should be about critical thinking. Like it's not just memorizing facts, right? It's
Right.
that we can have adults that can do research and come up with their own opinions. And I think AI wants to tell us what our opinions are, and that's a very scary endeavor, especially for young people that are, they're just forming who they are, and they're getting bombarded uh, with this information at a time when they're very susceptible, I think. As a parent, it's terrifying.
Right.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, guys. My job is to make people feel hopeful. Well, no, I think those are really realistic assessments, and we need to be aware. And so I do appreciate the frank.
I think no, but I think that the point of that, Wendy, really is to make people angry. People should be pissed off about what's happening before their very eyes, rather than complacent, rather than accommodating it. I really think people need to start thinking about how you start to throw some sand in the gears of this stuff, rather than just saying, "Oh, look what my phone can do now." Right? I think this is really it. We have choices. Everybody has choices, right? We can accommodate this, or we can say no.
And one thing, if I could jump in, kids are tossing their technology aside. Jim and I have a 22-year-old. A bunch of his friends are going to flip phones. They are turning their backs on technology, and they feel like they have been victims of it. And so there is a growing movement of neo-Luddism among the youth, among Gen Z, and I think that that's a beautiful thing. So there's your hope.
Thank you, Kelly.